this is Rick Snell, you're a pretty big part of the New York City bluegrass scene.
Hello, why thank you.
Yeah. So how old were you when you started playing guitar?
I would say I was 11 or 12, somewhere in there.
What kind of music did you start playing?
Oh, I wanted to play rock and roll music. I really wanted to play electric guitar, but my family's not very musical. My parents didn't play really. They did when they were younger, here and there, but they didn't really. They sort of turned to other folks for guidance. And I did have one cousin who was a pretty darn good guitar player, and he was actually teaching guitar at the time. And he told them get them started on acoustic music. So my plans were derailed pretty much right out of the gate.
Yeah.
But his idea was, my technique would be a lot better if I learned on acoustic guitar first, and I think that was good advice. So, yeah, I wanted to play rock and roll music and heavy metal and stuff like that.
Did you start with classical on the acoustic, or did you start with folk music?
I pretty much started. I learned really quickly. I started to get pretty good pretty fast. So I ended up getting a really great teacher that was getting me into basically the stuff I wanted to be playing.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing it on my acoustic guitar, and then, a few years later I ended up getting an electric guitar, so maybe 2 years after that. It seemed like a long time, but...
So then how were you introduced into bluegrass?
There's two people that had a big influence with that. One was my teacher. His name is Steve Cunningham. He's down in Atlanta now. I'm still in touch with him. He's one of the biggest musical influences on me. He was one of the kind of guru type individuals who would just, anytime he had someone, he had a lot of students, anytime he had someone that was really in it because they were an actual musician like myself and probably a couple other people, as opposed to their parents were making them do it or whatever it was. Anytime he had a student like that, he kind of really poured a lot into those lessons, and so he really opened up my eyes and my ears to a lot of stuff. I mean, he played me John Coltrane for the first time, and a lot of the great jazz guitarists that I became very into later. I never would have heard of if he had introduced me to them. And bluegrass was another thing that he really turned me on to. So sort of later in high school, I stayed on with him through high school and had other teachers as well in there, but he was the guy that turned me on to bluegrass as far as my teachers go. And later on, he was getting really into playing dobro, so that was the first time I ever saw dobro before. Probably one of the only dobros in Rochester, New York at the time. And he was sort of shifting more. He was a big electric player and played bluegrass a bit, but he wasn't, what you'd say like a full-time, flat-picking bluegrass guitar player. It was just one of the many things that he did very well. Mm-hmm. So that was a big part of my introduction. He got me playing my first couple tunes. And the other thing that was big for me was my best friend in high school. Totally coincidentally, his mom and his stepdad were bluegrass players and old-time players. So
cool.
I'd go over to their place, and they had this wall just like full of CDs, and it was all, bluegrass and folk and old-time. Mm-hmm. And his stepdad sort of grew up playing guitar and eventually turned to the banjo. He's a clawhammer player and played some mandolin. He did a little bit of everything. And he got my friend's mom playing fiddle, so they were very interested in the fact that I was a guitar player and I was, learning at such a young age and stuff. So she actually gave me a fiddle at one point, and my first few fiddle books, and so I was messing around with fiddle tunes there, and they took me to my first few bluegrass jam sessions, and it was always something I was interested in, but it didn't really become like a major focus of mine until some years later, because I was also studying classical guitar at the time, and I was also getting very into jazz, and I went on to go to college for a jazz degree, so that really took up my focus for those years. But later on after that, I sort of circled back around to bluegrass and got probably, I delved further into that than basically almost anything I had until that point. So, yeah, that was my first introduction.
Why are you in New York City for bluegrass?
Well, I didn't come here to play bluegrass per se. That was, again, one of my many interests musically, and my school was up in Westchester, SUNY Purchase. It's a great art school, which is part of the state school system here in New York. So that was an amazing education for me. I was young going to college. I was 17. I was a year younger than a lot of people. So it was my first real introduction to New York, because it was a short Metro North ride into the city, which I would do on the weekends, and started hanging around the city and meeting musicians and artists here, and like seeing music here for the first time. And if I had been driven, like for example, if I played 5-string banjo and was driven to play, in some hard driving bluegrass band, maybe I wouldn't have ended up in New York. But as a guitar player that had a lot of different interests, especially when I first moved here, I was still thinking I would be more in the jazz scene. And then as it happened, I ended up loosely around the Irish trad scene and playing it at more in like rock bands and stuff, and ended up doing my first tours and things and festivals and stuff when I first moved here after college. So I basically came here because my community from school was moving down from Westchester into Brooklyn and into the city, and those were people, that was like a whole world at that point.
Yeah.
For me, of artists and musicians that were just, my community. It was a very big community. And they came in New York and established themselves. Some of them have moved on to be very successful, and it kind of sort of started a scene here.
Yeah.
And that's a while back. So yeah, it was after that I sort of in New York started reconnecting with bluegrass, because there was a decent presence here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, actually New York had a lot to do with me taking that back up as a cause, and in my early years here. So yeah.
Do you think that there's a reason why there's such a strong scene now of bluegrass in New York?
I think there's a lot of reasons. Certainly like the Berklee program for American string music has a lot to do with like the new generations of players that are, they keep generating interest in it, and they keep cranking out these great players. And it seems like the more distinct among them are drawn to New York.
Yeah.
And I think it's like the lure of the city. It's a place like nowhere else.
Yeah.
Those people do. Some of them end up in Nashville. Some of them kick around Boston for a time, and they usually sort of fall out of love with Boston, it seems. And maybe it might be that Boston's not quite a big enough community to really sustain a whole scene outside of college. I don't know. I've never lived there, but and I think New York is a place for dreamers, and it's able to sustain people that are need a constant source of creativity. That has a lot to do with why I'm here. So
yeah.
And what passes for a scene for bluegrass and string music here is really it's just like groups of friends that are just kind of socially supporting each other.
Yeah.
And I see it ebb and flow, because I've been here long enough to see people move away and new people come in. So there's never seems to be more than like 5 great players on each instrument at a time. So it's not huge, but it's obviously a thing. Here we are talking about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, Boston has something to do with it. The city has a lot to do with it. The city itself, and it just attracts people with big dreams, I think. And yes, it might not attract specifically people that are looking to do something with country music or traditional music per se, but as I've often said, it's like it's a city where whatever you're looking for, you'll find it, and usually you'll find like the best example of it.
Yeah.
So.
So one really cool thing that you do is you run the Mona's Jam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you start that?
Yeah, I started that. We're coming up on 8 years ago now. So, was it 2011? I guess it was.
Yeah, that'd be 8 years ago.
Yeah, it's weird. I thought it was 2012, but we are coming up on 8 years. Yeah, I had been looking for a place to do a jam session for quite a while. It was on my radar as something to do, and I had a few offers from a few places that just didn't seem right to me. There's like a number of things I was looking for to make it work right, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And when Mona's first asked me, I had been going there on Tuesdays to be a part of their jazz night, and would sit in there for that and play some here and there. And I knew all the folks involved with that, and I knew it was a very kind of a magical place, you know, and,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of hard to explain like what draws people to a place like Mona's, and why it's such a rare place, and even in such a big city like this, with the changing times as they are, and with venues closing all over the place. There is a handful of these older, small, if you want to call it a venue, I guess it's a venue. But you know, there are a handful of places like that, like Sonny's, that are, you know, in Barbès, that are, you know, still doing some very good things for the musical community. So Mona's is very much on my radar for that. So when they asked me to do it, I thought about it for all of like 5 minutes before I decided like that's probably the best place for it.
Yeah.
And the rest is history.
Yeah. So how have you seen like the scene evolve there since you've been running that jam? Or have you?
That scene, you know, that jam has definitely attracted, you know, all of the great players that have come through town. And it's just it's a great, you know, it's a great event. I tell people it's a good date spot, you know, it's just like a chill place to hang, and like, if you're a musician, it's great to come and play, or not, just come and hang out, you know, just to be around all those musicians in that scene. It's like, it's super cool. So, I mean, I would do that a lot of times on Tuesdays. I would come to hang for the jazz session at Mona's, and oftentimes I'd play, but sometimes I just want to hang out, you know.
Yeah.
And there's other gigs like that around New York that are just sort of staples. It's like, you know, any Wednesday you can go see Smokey Hormel play at Sonny's, for example.
Yeah.
And that's just a great, fun thing to do, and it attracts a lot of musicians to just hang. So, how have I seen this scene evolve? I've certainly seen a couple rounds of recent, you know, classes of Berkeley, or just like younger musicians come into town. I've seen, you know, a couple waves of that happen.
Yeah.
I've also seen a nice sort of homegrown, you know, graduating class of people that are, you know, native to New York or just live here.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't necessarily come here to play, but have like, you know, worked up their skills on their instruments, and have become, you know, fine players in their own right, that, you know, that weren't necessarily on this trajectory to be a professional musician or a touring musician, but are kind of local to New York, and have a huge amount of love for it, and clearly have a good work ethic, and have put themselves, you know, in a few years have put themselves to task and have gotten to be pretty decent at their instruments. I've seen that, you know, over the years happen as well, which is cool.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those people go on to like start gigs of their own, or start bands of their own.
Yeah.
And they become, you know, parts of the community, like sort of leading figures in the community in their own ways. So that's really awesome, you know, it's great to see that as well.
Do you have any like standout moments at that jam, or in New York City in general?
Standout moments?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, you could point to any great player that's come through there. Like Michael Cleveland was there recently, and that was, you know, just amazing. Someone like that who's, anyone would say is one of the greatest fiddlers of all time, most likely in that, in bluegrass fiddle. Like, someone like that to come through, to play with them up close and see what they're doing it's just like, it really elevates what you expect can be done. It's true anytime anyone great comes through. There's so many great players that have come through over the years. We've had Billy Strings pick there a few times, and members of his band, members of Delamay come through here and there. We had Zoe on last week on bass. That was awesome. I don't want to single out any one person to the exclusion of anybody else. It's people ask me every week, like, how was it this week? And it should basically just stop asking me that question, because it's like every week is really great. It changes depending on who's in the room and who's playing. Yeah.
So, like, I guess in general, would you say that, how have you seen, like, the New York City scene evolve, like, as a whole?
The city as a whole? Or the bluegrass scene in New York?
Yeah.
As a whole. It's uncertain. You never know where it's going. There was a moment maybe 10 years ago when the Punch Brothers were first forming, 8 or 10 years ago, which was really cool. When those guys were just kicking around Brooklyn, and you'd see them out at every gig, and see their first show or first couple shows. That was like a really big moment. That group of musicians has gone on to just like nationally and internationally just expand and once again reintroduce people to this kind of music, and it's really great. So that was a great moment, and that really seemed to open up a lot of doors for that scene in New York. And but those guys have moved on. They're older now. They have kids. They're married. They're property owning individuals, I believe. A lot of them moved to Nashville. Some of them are they tend to pass through New York because, again, New York is just like a gateway. Even if you move away from the city, or even if you've never lived here, you're going to pass through and play. So that again is another reason why something like Mona's is amazing. Because a lot of these people just pass through, and then any given week, whoever happens to be there on a Monday, it's just like, oh great, this amazing musician was here. So it's always uncertain, right when you think that it's at a low point, then suddenly like 5 people move into town that are great. So I just try to keep working with as many people as I can, and I like to have that gig because it's an excuse to invite people to play and to it's very laid back and super fun, so it's fun to do it, and it's just a good thing to have. Right now there's been a ton of great things happening here. Again, I could point to any musicians, but of course the obvious people like Alex Hargreaves and Jake Jolliffe and that crew of people they're just doing great things. Jake has his own project which is amazing, and he's also in one of the biggest jam bands in that part of the scene. So, and we have Max and Mike, who have been also kind of getting a lot of work in the jam scene, which is really great. There's so much, it's hard to even know. I feel like I should have prepared some talking points here, because it's like there's so much to talk about. Maddie Whitler just moved to town, and she's an amazing mandolin player. The Feinberg brothers are around. I don't see them too much in New York. They're more in New Jersey, but I don't know those guys too well. I think it's probably on my radar to get to know them better, because they're really, really great, And that's actually, I think there's great things in store for them in the future, hopefully, because they've got that, the real traditional stuff happening, and they sound great. And also surrounding those guys, you think of them as like this new generation of player, but like they're surrounded by, the generation before them, and their dad plays with them, and he was like big in in the scene around New York before I was here, so you have all the players that are around that
Yeah.
are involved with those guys. Again, it's like, I don't know, I could probably keep on talking about all the guys that are passing through town. But as soon as someone moves away, then you're like, wow, didn't realize how much could rest on one person's shoulders. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Todd Livingston, the great dobro player. As soon as he moved out of town, it was like, well, there goes that great dobro player that was always around, and now there's kind of a lot less dobro in New York as a result of one person moving away.
Yeah.
But a lot of those guys, they want to move to Colorado or wherever it is. There's certain New York isn't for everybody.
Sure. So I'm sorry about this next question.
Mm-hmm.
If you could describe the scene, in one word or phrase,
Mm-hmm.
what would it be?
It's kind of like outlaws.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? New York is great because we're not beholden to some. There's no rules. Like in Nashville, you have to be a specific sort of player if you want to move a career forward. Let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's sort of a double-edged sword because it's like there is a career to be had there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas in New York, it's like there's not necessarily the same promise of some career in a touring act out of New York City. Although it's there to be done like it is to be done anywhere else, but I do, another one-word answer would be pure, I guess, because people are basically into this purely for the music.
Mm-hmm.
Again, because you're not, the likelihood of becoming a household name as a bluegrass artist in New York, I don't know, it's not super likely, I guess, but.
So you were talking about this kind of earlier, but why do you think there are so many younger musicians coming here? Because I know that traditionally, and in a lot of other places, the bluegrass scene is kind of older folks. But it seems like there are a lot of people in their early 20s and 30s here.
Mm-hmm. Well, to get to age 50, you got to be 20 first.
That's true.
And if you want to be good at playing an instrument, you probably have to spend those 20 years on it or thereabouts.
Yeah.
So they got to come from somewhere, right? But yeah, what draws? I don't know. It's a fun city. It's just so much to do here. So much music to see here.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the players that come here that are playing quote unquote bluegrass or are string players or whatever, they may have a little bit broader of a conception of what they're doing musically than the typical quote unquote bluegrass player. So you'll see these guys checking out the honky tonk bands and the Afrobeat bands and the reggae bands and the rock bands and the folk stuff and the old time stuff. There's so much that is so good, like you said, that it just, I think, really kind of sustains people in a way that they're not going to get if they go to Nashville. Or they'll get in different ways if they were in some place like New Orleans, definitely if they're in a place like LA, you're not going to just walk down the street and see mind-blowing music because you just happen to walk into a place where you heard the sounds coming through the door.
Yeah.
And New York's, for all of its warts, it still has that. You can still find great music. So if you're young and you're unencumbered, let's say, and you've got the wind in your hair, it's just this is a great place to be.
What would you say is something that motivates you to keep playing and put so much work into it?
It's basically everything I value in life in one way, shape, or form comes down to music. So I don't consider myself at all to be a finished product. I there are players around that talk about not really knowing what to practice, or they don't really practice much anymore, stuff like that. I get these conversations every so often, but I'm not one of those people. I'm constantly looking for things to work on, and there's always here we're just talking technique and stuff. There's always some things in there that I know I can get better at. So there's that's a big part of it, just from a craft standpoint. And then there's other things from, you know, the aesthetic standpoint. You know, I'm always trying to write more. Just like, it's almost like there's, however much of that you do, there's always more to be done, you know. And, you know, so there's things just from the musical perspective that are hugely important to me, that I feel like, you know, I'm not where I want to be, so I'm always working on that. As satisfied as I am with what I do, you know, there's things I want to get better at, you know. So, and it's just for an instrument like guitar, where like every great world music has involved the guitar in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. It's just like, you know, the more you listen to things, the more you want to do more things, and then the more you realize like how almost every time you pick up a new style, it's like learning an entirely new instrument, even though it happens to have the same amount of strings and it's tuned the same. Let's say not necessarily, but you know, usually it's tuned the same. You know, the technique might become completely different, or the sound and the tone might be completely different, or, you know, it calls on completely different things. So, you know, every time I work on a country blues tune, I just think to myself, like, man, if only I did this all the time, because then I would be like, you know, I'm a pretty decent country blues player, but, you know, it's not what I spent my entire life doing on the guitar. So it's like, you know, everything you spend your time on as a guitarist, it's like, well, that could be your entire life, but because it's an instrument that's so ubiquitous, you know, in you know, all of American music for sure, as well as music from around the world, it's like it's just limitless how much fun you can have with it. So, and then of course, you know, just back to your question, like what keeps me coming back to it, you know, there's, you know, my social life is based around music, you know. Every person I know, more or less, is a musician at this point. I try to sort of regulate that, actually, to a degree, because I feel like to past a certain point, it's like, well, there's a lot more out there in the world, so I should probably talk to, you know, other types of people. Let me meet some neuroscientists, you know what I mean? Like, but yeah, socially, it's all there. It's a part, you know, it's a big part of, well, it's the way I make my living, so that's a part of it too. Conveniently enough. So, yeah, all those things. All of this and more.
Yeah. So this doesn't have to do with like the New York City scene, but there's kind of like this stereotype of bluegrass that people who I guess aren't really familiar with it have. Kind of like an old country kind of music. How would you like explain this kind of music to someone who kind of thinks like doesn't know what it is?
Well, some of that is true, some of that is deserved, right? Like, some of it is, if you're one of these more traditional minded people, like, you know, you want to hear how, you know, the sort of the fathers of bluegrass, Flatt and Scruggs and Bill Monroe, obviously, and Jimmy Martin, and that generation of players, the Louvin brothers, like, you know, if that's what your ear is going for, then it is kind of an older sound, and there's something so compelling about that there's many fans of bluegrass that go for that. But it's almost like that's like one of the subgenres of the music, right? Because if you're going to sort of put things under a broader umbrella of, like, you know, like American string music, which is kind of, at least how I think about it. You know, I run this session called the Bluegrass session, and at Mona's, and but like, there's not a part of me that takes that like literally and like prohibitively, you know, to the letter of the law. Like, if someone obviously comes in and wants to play clawhammer banjo, I'm like all for that, you know. I'm not going to be like, no, it's not bluegrass. Like, I look at it more, even though it's called a bluegrass session, it's like, I look at it as like a broader, under the umbrella of like American string music. And even to that point, like, things that are, you know, string music that's not American is also welcome, you know. But, you know, I wish there was a way to have like klezmer be a regular part of that, or Cajun be a regular part of it, or like, you know, Scottish and Irish fiddling, and, you know, but that's just hasn't been the scene hasn't really organized itself in that way, but from my perspective, like all that stuff is absolutely related and totally welcome. So yeah, if you're going to look at things in that broader perspective, then bluegrass is one of those string-based music. So it's almost like defining terms. It does seem like the younger generation that's in New York, at least, does kind of look at things from that broader perspective, where they're not trying to do this one traditional 1945 sound, or 1950s brothers duet sort of sound. But there are those that do have that in there as a strong influence in what they're trying to do. It's almost like different dials you can turn up or turn down in your playing, or when you start a band, what it is that you're trying to go for. So I will say, sort of in more broad, in specific terms, like it's music that has this strong tie to tradition, and yet it's very much alive, and there are people doing very beautiful, very sort of forward-thinking new things with it all over the place. And I think it's turn to those people and just listen to what they're doing, and there's your answer right there, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking to me.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks, Emma.